Good morning, everyone. I am calling to order our meeting of the Committee of the Whole. My name is Elizabeth Glidden. I'm the chair of this committee, and I'm joined today by council members Gordon, Cano, Reich, Bender, Andrew Johnson, Yang, Quincy, Warsami, Goodman, Fry, and Palmisano. We're a quorum of the committee. All right, and I'm sorry, I'm just looking at, there's sometimes we title things consent versus discussion versus public hearing. There are just a couple little adjustments we're going to make, but we'll make them as we go through the agenda. So our first item is a public hearing. It is on the amendments to the municipal minimum wage ordinance, and I am not sure who is doing the presentation on that. Looks like Mr. Nilsson from the City Attorney's Office. If you'd like to introduce that topic, please.
Yes. Thank you, Chair Glidden. Eric Nilsson, Minneapolis City Attorney's Office. You have before you a technical amendment to the minimum wage ordinance, which was adopted in June of this year. It's a technical amendment, but it's an important amendment. The ordinance incorporates the state law definition of employee, incorporates it by reference. And the state law definition of employee has a long laundry list of exemptions. One of them is quoted, any individual employed in a bona fide executive, administrative, or professional capacity. And in the rules interpreting that exemption, that effectively refers to salaried persons. It's not an issue for determination of business size for purposes of the state minimum wage, because the state minimum wage is based on annual gross revenue, not employee count as the city's ordinance is. And so the amendment simply makes it clear that the business size calculation in the city's ordinance, the determination of large versus small business for purposes of phasing in of the minimum wage, is based on the number of people who work for compensation for the business in total, including salaried persons. With that, I'll stand for questions.
All right, thank you very much. And I apologize to my colleagues. I'm still getting my speaker management open. Is there anyone who has any questions, informational questions before we open the public hearing? I'm not seeing any. So we have a public hearing on this item. I will open the public hearing. We do have two people who have signed in to speak. The first is Michael Powell. Is Mr. Powell here? Michael? Yes, sir.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Yes, and I should say I apologize that if you could keep your comments to kind of in the 2-minute range, that would be appreciated. Thank you, sir.
Okay, I'm here to speak on my experiences in race and equity.
Okay, that we are going to do for the race and equity, division of race and equity. So we are going to do a separate public hearing on that, and I will call on you for that.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. And we had a second person signed up, Michelle Shoreham, and I don't know if that person also was here for minimum wage technical amendment or for the division of race and equity. Is that person here, Michelle? I'm not seeing anyone. All right, is anyone here who would like to testify on the minimum wage amendment? Seeing none, I will go ahead and close the public hearing. As the city attorney had described, this really is something that is probably more in the nature of a technical amendment. And I will go ahead and move approval of this amendment. Is there any discussion on that motion? Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, and that item is approved. All right, we are to our second public hearing and presentation, and this is on a proposal to establish through ordinance a division of race and equity. Ms. Nuria Rivera-Vandermeid.
Good morning, council members.
Good morning.
My name is Nuria Rivera-Vandermeid, and I promise you that I feel better than I sound, I bet. The ordinance before you represents the hard work teams and departments and individual contributors across the enterprise have made towards a commitment to ensure racial equity is at the forefront of their work. It echoes the voices in community that tell us we can and must do better to bridge the inequity gaps that spread across our city. And it builds upon the courage of all our elected leaders, those who are with us now and those who came before you, who stood up for those often underrepresented in our community, to create policies aimed at ensuring all people in Minneapolis thrive. The work of advancing racial equity in our city is not new. Our legislative history is full of resolutions, staff directions, work plans, and policy changes that have urged us all to do more to advance equity in our city, and we have seen some success in those past efforts. If we were to draw a timeline of those efforts, we'd see perhaps that our efforts evolved from focusing on singular topics like workforce diversity or supplier diversity to more holistic approaches that require us to dig deeper to identify the root causes for institutional racism that every community, every city, and every government faces. This council term alone saw the policymakers name and define racial equity and the investment of funds to support the addition of staff and training to ensure we had a solid and collectively understood foundation from which to build on. This term also saw truly transformative actions aimed at improving lives, building wealth in communities, and ensuring the city had an opportunity to hear from a broader set of community voices. Not all that transformation came from a positive place, as some of the difficulties we faced this term also made us rethink whether we were in fact making strides to improve community trust with government. Some examples, and certainly not exhaustive, of that transformative work include the passage of extraordinary labor laws like sick and safe leave and minimum wage, the historic investment in parks and street funding, the adoption of the Blueprint for Equitable Engagement, the adoption of the Green Zones Initiative that incorporates concepts of environmental equity throughout its analysis, the inclusion of racial equity as a major tenet woven into our comp plan work, the continued investment in our housing policies aimed at ensuring we continue to find ways to ensure affordable housing is available for all those that need it, including ensuring that those most in need are not discriminated against on the basis for how they choose to pay for housing or are at risk for being preyed upon by landlords who provide living conditions that we deem unacceptable and unsafe. The investment and approval of grant-funded initiatives like the Innovation Team, the Promise Zone, our resilience work, and the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice, all of which have racial equity at their core. Policy decisions that have tried to remove artificial barriers to our community, like the elimination of lurking and spitting laws, as well as those aimed at removing artificial barriers to small businesses, many of which are immigrant and minority-owned businesses. And recent investments in our immigrant and refugee support aimed at ensuring everyone in our community feels welcome in the city and have access to legal access in an era where pervasive uncertainty exists for many of our residents. This term also saw departments make investments in their own racial equity work. Department teams formed in many of our departments, and data was used strategically to advance the efforts that bridge inequity gaps instead of serving all equally. We have in this room many of our racial equity coordinators that departments have said, yes, we are willing to make sure that our staff provides and contributes to the work of racial equity across the city. The investment in training, from the multi-course Foundations of Equity training offered by Internal Equity Team to enterprise training from our HR department, emphasizing, and for some staff requiring, cultural agility and competence, particularly for those charged with hiring and promotional activities, and publications of dashboards like the Spend Diversity Dashboard and the Workforce Dashboard that not only help us improve our efforts in this regard, but also provide greater transparency and accountability for our collective work, have helped us be more strategic in identifying the tremendous opportunity for improvement. So with all this good work, why do we need this ordinance? Because, quite frankly, there is more to be done, and we can accelerate this work by working collectively and consistently across the enterprise. Because all of this work has laid the foundation for us to evolve and elevate our efforts, to move beyond those that impact our individual activities, to ensuring we move collectively to weave into the city's very fabric principles of institutional and structural equity. Because all of these efforts have poised us to expect more from ourselves, from moving from well-intended conversations to siloed progress to collective accountability. Because this ordinance helps define expectations of what was intended when policymakers defined racial equity at the beginning of their term, and creates affirmative responsibilities in each and every one of us to further racial equity in a manner that is informed, and consistent across the enterprise. Because it ensures we have better mechanisms by which to account for progress by calling for the establishment of specific goals and metrics that years ago we were not in a position to accurately identify. Because it ensures that the institutional processes we create, from budget to performance reviews to business plans, further our commitment to racial equity. And importantly, because it builds an accountability and transparency by ensuring staff reports back to policymakers on individual and collective progress to ensure we remain on track to achieve the outcomes we're all trying to achieve. In essence, it codifies and affirms your commitment to racial equity and the commitment to ensuring we are accountable to our community and living out the goals we set forth. One Minneapolis, where disparities are eliminated so all Minneapolis residents can participate and prosper. I want to take a moment to thank our key partners in the offices of City Attorney's Office, Civil Rights, HR, NCR, the Clerk's Office, and importantly, our own coordinators, equity staff. Their work over the years has been invaluable, and I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge their amazing contributions that brought us here. I'd also be remiss if I didn't thank each and every one of you, and including Mayor Hodges, for continuing to move us forward and making the achievement of racial equity throughout our communities a priority for us all. With that, I stand for questions.
All right. Are there informational questions on the ordinance? We can also do that after the public hearing. There are some people signed up, and I know there are others who are here and may wish to speak. Any immediate things? I'm not seeing anything. So we'll go ahead and open the public hearing. And I do have a few people signed up. Brett Grant is the first speaker.
Good morning, Chair Glidden and members of the committee. My name is Brett Grant. I'm with Voices for Racial Justice. Voices for Racial Justice supports the ordinance to establish the Division of Race and Equity as part of the Office of the City Coordinator. We also advocate for adequate and increased funding for the Division of Race and Equity. In addition, we want to challenge the city to think deeply about the language of Section 21.158, which, quote, ensures that all communities receive information and have the opportunity to shape city policies and services. As an organization that works to advance racial equity in Minnesota, Voices for Racial Justice recognizes that achieving racial equity is only possible when local communities are able to shape the policies and services which shape racial equity. That is why we are inspired to see language in the ordinance that reflects a commitment to community engagement, particularly in relation to racial and ethnic communities. In the process of embedding racial equity principles throughout city operations, programs, services, and policies, the city will have to talk to racial and ethnic communities and talk with them often. One of our partners who worked with the city of Oakland on the ordinance that created the Department of Race and Equity in 2015 shared some of his experiences with us when he was in Minneapolis. He emphasized the importance of funding the city's commitment to racial equity so that this commitment lives outside of policymaking and becomes embedded in city practice. It is possible to undermine the intent of this ordinance by starving it of a budget. We ask the City Council to take its commitment seriously. He also named the importance of building strong community engagement, investing in the time it takes to develop trusting relationships so that community knowledge and experience can inform the work of the city. Voices for Racial Justice has tools to support this type of work. Our authentic community engagement principles have guided our organization and also the work of partner organizations and government. These principles grew out of work with the Minnesota Department of Health. And the Racial Equity Impact Assessment is a tool we urge policymakers to apply in developing policy that intends to advance racial equity. The assessment names 5 simple steps that should inform the decision-making process. I'll concentrate on the last one. Can the policy be sustainably successful? Where sustainably successful means that can the policy ensure that adequate funding, implementation strategies, and accountability mechanisms are in place? In conclusion, Voices for Racial Justice fully supports the adoption of this ordinance as an important step in advancing racial equity practice within the city of Minneapolis. We applaud the intent of this proposed ordinance as well as the internal structure it puts in place. We look forward to continuing work with the city leaders to make racial equity a reality in Minneapolis. Thank you.
Thank you. We have Gabriela Deal Marquez. Okay. Stephen Belton.
Councilmember Glidden and members of the council, thank you for the opportunity to address you in this matter. My comments can be summarized very quickly in saying that this is an important ordinance. The Minneapolis Urban League supports it, but only on the condition that you are prepared to move ahead and to do something more serious than you are doing now. To put it bluntly, we've had enough opportunities, enough initiatives that have simply taken the first step and stopped. This requires that you do the hard thing, not the easy thing. It's easy to pass an ordinance, although I think Councilmember Glidden might say, given her tenure and the time, that it's just now coming that she might contend with that statement. But it's easy to pass an ordinance. It's hard to fund and fully support the ordinance. And so what you haven't done here and what is not in this ordinance is funding and staffing for this department. It's not a secret, and it doesn't take rocket science to figure out where the city's priorities are. The priorities are where you put money. You are not putting money behind this ordinance. And so I would say it's not a priority. We support it nonetheless because you can make it a priority. You can change that. Put the resources into this effort that need to be done. You created an Office of Equity in 2015. You haven't funded that properly. Only because of the good work, the intelligence, and the commitment of the single person you have in that office and the additional staff provided through recast grant, you've been able to move some things forward. But you are stalled. The city is stalled because you have inadequately funded it. You have not made it a priority. And despite the self-congratulatory parade of great things that you heard in the introduction of this effort, the city of Minneapolis continues to lag behind the country. We have an appalling rate of racial disparities. I hope this makes you uncomfortable, not my words, but the thought of actually committing to this work seriously, because racial equity work should make you uncomfortable. It's not easy, it's not comfortable. We have a long and tortured history of addressing race in this country and in this community, and we should not be congratulating ourselves about the little bitty efforts that we take and that we make in the aggregate or individually. This ordinance provides an opportunity to put under a single umbrella the city's commitment and its work, but that commitment will be empty, it will be a sham, and it will be an embarrassment if you do not put the resources necessary to get it done. So you're creating a new division with this ordinance, give it staff. You're creating a new division for race and equity, give it the financial resources, the allocation that it needs to get the work done. And finally, I would say, and most importantly, then drive this home by making every department head, including the city coordinator, accountable for results. Right now, there is no accountability for racial equity. There simply is aspiration. And I'm tired of aspiration. Our communities are tired of your aspirations. What we want is a commitment demonstrated by your funding, and then we would like you to hold people accountable for getting this work done. It's too important to miss this opportunity now. Thank you.
Thank you. We have Michael Powell. Is that gentleman still here? No. Michelle Schornborn didn't need to speak. I think there are some other people who maybe didn't sign up but would like to speak. Anyone else who would like to speak as part of the public hearing? Come on forward. Let us know your name, and then I'll invite you to step over there to sign up after you speak.
Actually, Madam Chair, I did sign up.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah, I was on one of the lists.
All right.
I'm Russ Adams. I'm with an organization called the Alliance. We work on urban growth and development issues and apply a racial and economic equity lens. I'm speaking in favor of the ordinance. I have been tracking a lot of the discussion surrounding it, some really sharp critiques and a lot of supportive comments. And I think we've already heard some that we should give really serious consideration. I think an ordinance like this brings out a lot of the hope and a lot of the concerns, and it kind of leads us to try to create a vision, but also reminds us of past efforts that have fallen short. I see this very much as building off of the foundation that this council and some other councils have tried to start to lay in the ground. And really, this is about adding another layer of mortar, another layer of brick. But as some of the comments that you've received point out, we're not nearly where we need to be. And implementation is much harder than aspiration. A couple of suggested areas for you to consider. I agree with the comments that more funding should be put into this office. I agree that it should have real authority. We should find ways to lift up the office within the overall departmental structure to give it relevance. And accountability structure should be built in, should be baked in. Community-led decision-making and engagement is really an important part of this to anchor the efforts that you're doing in community where a lot of the wisdom lies. Finally, I think you have some opportunities on the horizon in terms of your equitable hiring. You've made some good strides in that. Housing is going to be a major issue in 2018. The Section 8 anti-discrimination policy is one of the good starts that you've had, but the crisis is at such an overwhelming level that it is really going to draw a lot of attention next year. Your vendor contracting is another place where this city could shine in this region. Station area plans for Southwest LRT, I still believe that project is going to come forward. There'll be some major equitable development opportunities for you there. Upper Harbor Terminal. And finally, I would really encourage the city to send staff to the Policy Link Equity Summit in 2018, April 11th through 13th. There are some stipends to help community members who can't afford to get there. Some resources might be available for public sector, but we really need agencies and cities to step forward and say, we believe in this so much, we're going to send our staff to these kinds of national trainings. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else who would like to speak as part of the public hearing? If you would say your name, please, and then sign up afterwards over there.
Sure. Hi, my name is Isaiah Breen, and I'm here on behalf of Jewish Community Action. JCA brings together members of the Twin Cities Jewish community to advocate for social, racial, and economic justice. Our sacred text reminds us to welcome the stranger into our community because we were strangers too. This commandment guides our work here in the Twin Cities, and it directs us to do all we can to desegregate our fractured city and build a community where all people, regardless of the color of their skin, are treated fairly. While our city has made a commitment in recent years to eliminating the racial disparities in our schools, businesses, and neighborhoods, Minneapolis remains one of the most unequal communities in the United States. Black residents in the Twin Cities are 3 times as likely as white residents to live below the poverty line. An average black worker will earn more than $30,000 a year less than a comparable white worker. White students in Minnesota have some of the nation's best reading, math, and college entrance exam scores, but our home state is one of America's worst for non-white students. Minnesota has worse racial disparities than almost any other state. We believe this ordinance will be another step towards eliminating those disparities. Council Vice President Glidden and the City Council have already taken us in the right direction by creating and staffing the Office of Equity and Inclusion. This ordinance will ensure race equity work remains a required part of the city structure for the future. It will not go away with the ups and downs of elections or individuals in key city staff roles. As Jews, we recognize a single common humanity shared by all of us. We believe each human being is a full and unique Tselem Elohim, a reflection of God's presence in the world. We see this belief embodied in the Council's efforts to promote racial equity, and we see it in this ordinance. We look forward to working with the Minneapolis City Council to pass this ordinance in pursuit of our vision of a more just world, and we thank Vice President Glidden for her courageous leadership on this critical issue.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak as part of the public hearing? All right. Anyone else? Not seeing anyone else. I will then close the public hearing. Kind of open my. And I'm here. So I had sent around, and I think up there may be some extra copies of a very slightly revised ordinance. I'll explain what is different. It includes a very short definition of division. Intended to be very general, but there was no definition of division, so that is included. And as 21.155, A5, excuse me. The other change was there was just like a little smoothing out of language. There was a little bit of some repetition, maybe just some extra phrasing. So it doesn't change any of the provisions or any of the subdivisions. They all remain exactly the same with the same points made, but just some of that language smoothing so that this reads more directly. And I want to thank Councilmember Andrew Johnson for assisting to ensure we just had something that read a little bit more smoothly. So for folks to know that, I will go ahead and move this slightly updated version of the ordinance and then see if there's any discussion on it. Councilmember Andrew Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to recognize all your work on this and the work of others, including our staff on this as well. I think this is such a critically important ordinance, and it really is institutionalizing the need to tackle systemic racism and racial disparities. And it's that foundation, it's that framework. I agree with one of our speakers who said we really need to put our investments and resources behind ensuring that this is enforced and that this work is carried out. But I think that this is a really incredible product, and it's work that I and the returning council members and the incoming council members are going to be responsible for having to ensure that this is well executed and followed through with over the years to come. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for all your work on this and the work of everyone else on this ordinance.
Any other comments on this ordinance? I'm not seeing any. I will make just a few comments then on the ordinance. First I'll just say this, this is not really something that kind of popped out of, the air. This is direction that we've had from community members, but also staff from the city about how do we clarify what it seems to be some fuzzy statements over the years about what are our intentions. How do we ensure that the work moves forward? So I'll just say a couple things about what I, at least personally, was intending here. One is, I will say, even in 12 years, you see sometimes that initiatives come and go. And that's not any aspersions on anyone. It's just kind of the way sometimes things work in the city. And I think anybody who's had any interaction with the city or anybody kind of knows that's true. But this, if we're going to do the work properly, this is long-term work, and it needs to be more pointed. It needs to be more direct. So that was one thing, to kind of create a permanency of what is acknowledged to be long-term work, I think, by anybody who has done substantial work on this. The second thing is, I will say that, there's a beauty to the city structure, and sometimes there's a frustration to the city structure for the city of Minneapolis. But we have kind of this flat structure. We have a structure where every department head is essentially the same level to all the other department heads. And it does create, I think, a direct accountability to policymakers, but policymakers, we're not managers. We vote on policy or give direction, but we don't manage how functions happen. And so if there's not a clarity to an expectation around a function happening, it's very hard to ensure that function happens. So this was kind of another intention, is to give more clarity. There are some things in here that provide some accountability measures, some requirements about annual reporting in a public forum, so that the community can also follow and monitor and have input on progress or non-progress. So that was another kind of intention. I take to heart the words of I think every speaker, which is that if you don't resource the work cannot get done. And so I think that this ordinance, which provides some more clarity around what are some expectations, but it also provides kind of the umbrella where you can add to what are those expectations, I hope provides the entry point to understand what results you'll get from investment. And if we don't invest, we won't get results. And that's just the long and the short of it. You know, I attended the other night a public honoring of the McKnight Distinguished Artist of this year, Seitu Jones. I was honored to be asked to attend, and that felt really special to me. But in his speech as the McKnight Distinguished Artist, the most prominent part of that speech was about racism in our society and individual discrimination he had faced, including recently. He talked about, and we've had this report on the cultural economy and how that economy is not benefiting artists of color in the way that it should. So we've heard that. He talked about how he is, I think, the second McKnight artist of color who has been the McKnight Distinguished Artist. And then he told a story about driving to Michigan. He had been commissioned to do a special artwork, and he ended up being awarded a big prize for that, actually, from the state of Michigan. And on his way there, he has stopped as he's driving in a van with a big piece of artwork that he is intending to put together, and he stopped by the side of the road. And he said he was going 73 and a 70, and he stopped. He's pulled over. He is asked to get out of the vehicle, and he's asked to open the back, and he's asked if he has any drugs in the car. I mean, it was this whole story. It was. So anyway, I just tell you that because this is the McKnight Distinguished Artist, using his time at his very, very special event to make sure we understand how critical these issues are for us to work on around race and racism. So with that, I'm not seeing any further comment. All in approval of this ordinance, please say aye. 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 Opposed? And that is approved. Thank you very much. Next, we have we need to set a public hearing for an ordinance amending Title II, Chapter 19 of the Minneapolis Code of Ordinances relating to administration, employee authority, and immigration matters, adding a new section on certification procedures for crime victims in connection with federal immigration laws. So I will move to set that public hearing for December 13th, 10 a.m. Discussion. All in approval, please say aye. 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 Opposed? I'm actually going to skip item number 4, which I think will take a little more conversation, and go to item number 5. Item number 5 is an amendment to the Civil Rights Ordinance. It got a significant amount of discussion. It was its home committee is the Public Safety, Civil Rights, and Emergency Management Committee, chaired by Councilmember Blong Yang, and I understand that there were some last requests for a language change, and I think that's the only change that was discussed. And so, Council President Johnson has an amendment. Do you want to speak to that?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and should be in front of you. And actually, what was being proposed was to eliminate the reference to the city, and I don't have the language in front of me, is to eliminate the language about creating ghettos. And it's old, it's outdated language, but I thought it was important that we keep the underlying thought behind it. And so we're changing the language to eliminate the existence and the development of any racially concentrated areas of poverty in the community. And actually that ties nicely, it seems to me, with the discussion that we just had about our new division, that as we look at Minneapolis historically, and a lot of the issues that we have around racial segregation in our city are because of decisions that are made perhaps unthinkingly, perhaps deliberately, and have resulted in real challenges in individual communities in the city. And so I think it's important to keep that in front of us. We know that when we have a community that is racially concentrated, we have challenges there that don't exist in other communities, with schools, with crime at times, being victims of crime, being places where, in our recent history, sex offenders are concentrated. It's really a challenge. And so I think it's important for us to keep the idea in front of us as being part of our city's mission to look at these areas and decide policies that would eliminate these kind of negative consequences in our city. So that's my change.
All right. Well, I'll move the underlying ordinance, and I will just take this as Council President Johnson has moved to amend to add the language. Any discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Back to the original full amendment. Any discussion on that? Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? And that item is approved. Thank you very much. We will return back to item number 4, which is a resolution for a racial equity steering committee and racial equity community advisory committee. And I will turn to Councilmember Cam Gordon, who is bringing that forward on behalf of himself and me.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice President. And these two things before you originally was written as one resolution, but with the clerk's recommendation that we separate the resolution that would create the advisory committee. So there's two resolutions. Essentially, the first resolution before you is codifying or lifting up some work that's already being done. We've talked about it many times. We have been establishing a racial equity steering committee. That's a staff group that's taking some leadership over the development of a racial equity action plan. In the resolution, there's some additions that are made to the steering committee. It adds a policymaker from the city council and also someone from the mayor's office on that leadership team that would be drafting the racial equity action plan. It also defines a time when they could report back, which is in June, which should give us time to see what the action plan is and see if there's any budget implications for the next year, which is one of the responses I might make to people concerned about where is the money coming for our division. This will give us some chance to do that in a thoughtful way. I could speak to the other piece of this also, which is the second resolution, which would create the community group, community advisory committee. This is something that I think I've brought up every time we get an update on the work that we're doing in the division, something that's been talked about many times. And I think it's something that would really be important for us to get in place now, not that the group will actually be set up now, but we're going to establish it. It will improve the accountability, I think, the transparency, but also it's actually going to let the steering committee do a better job of developing the racial equity action plan if we have some community stakeholders at the table. And this community advisory committee would report annually back to the council, but there's also a feature there where they would do some kind of a report out to the community on an annual basis. The community group also would have a seat for the school board and the park board. Those are some changes that were made to this idea when Councilmember Glidden and I were vetting it with some community members at some meeting, and there was some input that we gathered from them, I think would actually strengthen this idea, and people are excited about it. There's one small change that was made from the agenda when I was discussing it and reviewing it with committee members, council members, and especially the council member Fry. The way it was originally written, the entire committee was to be appointed by the city council and then approved by the mayor. But there is a sense that the mayor might want to make 2 appointments of his own, and so that's in the amended substitute language that I want to move that should be before you now. And with that, I can take any questions.
All right. I will. Why don't you go ahead and move both items?
All right, and we'll move both items.
We'll see if there's discussion. I'm not seeing any, so I will go ahead and call for the vote. Councilmember Gordon has moved both the resolution on the Racial Equity Steering Committee And also the Race Equity Action Plan. All in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? And those items are approved. Thank you. Now we turn to reports of committees with Community Development and Regulatory Services. First with Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. There are 24 items on our agenda for approval tomorrow. There are a number of land sales as well as license applications. I do want to note a couple of items of interest. Item number 4, hopefully will be the final action that we will take to revoke the rental licenses currently held by Steve Friends. I will note that we are not going to be issuing any temporary licenses or conditional licenses in this matter. We are going to be working with the City Attorney's Office in order to get involved in potentially seeing that a receiver be appointed. I would direct all questions with regard to the city's quasi-judicial action to Susan Siegel, who is here today, if there are any questions. I'll also note that we are carrying forward a portion of our tax-exempt bonding authority. We are doing that because there are a number of projects that have not closed and will not probably close before the end of the year. This is an important thing to note because if we find out that the final version of the tax bill eliminates our entitlement authority, we could have a number of projects that have been approved where tax credits and bonds have been allocated but not closed on that would be in limbo. And this could be a problem, not unlike the problem we had at the beginning of this year when the tax credit market fell out, the bottom fell out from under it. So I want to make sure folks are aware of those two things as it pertains to funding affordable housing. With regard to the rest of the agenda, there are a number of actions to preserve and refinance affordable housing in more long-term preservation modes, as well as a couple of changes to our homegrown small business fund and allocating just under $500,000 in ESG capital funding to a number of projects that have life safety issues they need to deal with. With that, I will happily answer questions about items 1 through 24, and note we will be having a CD meeting as well next Tuesday.
All right. Thank you, Councilmember Goodman. I'm not seeing questions. Next, we have Health, Environment, and Community Engagement. Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice President. The Health, Environment, and Community Engagement Committee is bringing 5 items forward for consideration to the Council. The first 2 are appointments to some of our advisory groups. The first one is approving 2 appointees for the Minneapolis Community Environmental Advisory Commission, and the second is approving various appointees to the Homegrown Minneapolis Food Council. The third item is authorizing acceptance of a grant of $90,000 from the Minnesota Department of Public Safety. This will help us with our early intervention program for young people at risk for involvement with violence. Fourth item is authorizing submittal of a grant. This is a little bit larger grant from Minnesota Department of Human Services for $1.3 million over 3 years, which would help us expand our mental health services for our school-based clinics. And the fifth item was a passage of a resolution establishing a framework for the clean energy funding for Minneapolis. This was also referred to the Ways and Means Committee and is part of the franchise-free increase considerations in the budget. Happy to take any questions.
All right. Let me double check. Nope, I don't see any questions. Next, we have the Intergovernmental Relations Committee. For that committee, we have item number 1 is submitting comments to the Public Utilities Commission relating to a grant award to Crown Hydro. Item number 2 was approving a amendment to the federal legislative agenda relating to federal tax code reform. Item 3 is passing a resolution opposing the conceal and carry reciprocity laws in a federal government issue. And finally was on the 2018 legislative policy positions. It was approving an additional policy position to the current bonding list for the family partnerships bonding request relating to their headquarters building. So, and I'm not seeing questions on that. Next, we have Public Safety, Civil Rights, and Emergency Management with Councilmember Yang.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. We will be bringing 9 items to Friday. First item is a contract amendment with Translanguages LLC. Second item is a grant with Minnesota Homeland Security and Emergency Management for police bomb disposal. Third item is a joint powers agreement for participation in the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension Human Trafficking Investigators Task Force. Fourth item is a contract amendment with Foresight Consulting Services. Fifth item are appointments to the Police Conduct Oversight Commission. The sixth item is appointments to the Minneapolis Commission on Civil Rights. The seventh item are amendments to the Police Conduct Oversight Ordinance. The eighth item is an unmanned aircraft ordinance. Ninth item are staff directions with regards to the Police Conduct Oversight Committee and the Minneapolis Commission on Civil Rights. And we had an extra 10th item that was put onto the Cal meeting with regards to the Civil Rights Ordinance. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Next, we have Transportation and Public Works with Councilmember Reich.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. The committee will be forwarding 22 items. All items reflect the activities, projects, and material purchasing of the typical activities of the department. So I will point out item 22 is the Zero Waste Plan adoption and development of the 3-year implementation and the staff direction to put into effect a 3-year implementation plan. Pretty significant movement on that front. I'll stand for questions on any item.
Thank you. Next, wait a minute. All right, Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was actually in the queue for the public safety civil rights budget.
apologies.
I just wanted to make one comment about item number 7 in that report. We had a public hearing and forwarded the police conduct oversight changes to council with approval recommended. I wanted to say that one of the outstanding items was to take some feedback received at that hearing and to socialize it with the mayor's office, civil rights, and the police department, and I have done so. So I do plan on Friday and coming forward with the change that takes into account some of the feedback we heard at the public hearing. That specific change is that we will be seeking to have the head of the Police Conduct Oversight Commission decided by the commissioners instead of by the mayor's office, as one additional way we can be listening to the community in this at this time, and one way that we can help improve the civilian oversight mechanism of our city. Thanks.
Thank you. Next, we have Ways and Means Committee with Did I miss somebody else waiting to speak? Okay, Councilmember Gordon.
Thank you. Just briefly, I wanted to thank Councilmember Palmisano for mentioning this and bringing it forward. I think that's a good change and a good amendment. We've hit that problem a few times when we were appointing people onto the commission and who's going to be chair in that. So I'm happy to support that tomorrow or Friday.
All right, thank you. Next, Ways and Means, Councilmember Quincy.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. There are 30 items that Ways and Means will be bringing forward for consideration on Friday. The bulk of which are significant only in terms of amount and contract amendments and closeouts for a number of projects throughout the city. I'd also like to highlight that there were 6 legal settlements, and there's one pending item that we'll need to have that was sent forward without recommendation related to Officer Griffin's request for legal services reimbursement. So we'll be taking that up on Friday. I also wanted to point out, in addition, there were the 2 franchise agreement ordinances that were passed out of our committee and that would be highlighted on for Friday's meeting, as well as master contracts for 10 firms. This is for short-term investment providers. This is an extension of our target market program as we were trying to provide more opportunities for local banks to participate in investment services. So that was an important addition to our policies and procedures. And the final item I wanted to highlight was the city investment policy review and updates, which was item number 14 on our agenda. And that concludes the bulk of the report. If happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you. Oops. Councilmember Quincy, and last we have Zoning and Planning with Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We have 6 items from zoning and planning. The first is denying a local landmark designation for a church at 2501 Columbus Avenue, in keeping with the desire of the church community. Item number 2 is appointments to our Minneapolis Arts Commission. Item number 3 is a rezoning at 1120 West Broadway to allow for a shopping center. And item number 4 is a drainage and utility easement on the block bounded by 51st Avenue North between Girard and Humboldt. Item number 5 is approval of the Van White Memorial Boulevard Station Small Area Plan, and it included a staff direction that Council President and Councilmember Yang brought forward for us. And item number 6 is passage of an ordinance amending our code and revising the pet boarding regulations in our zoning code.
All right. With that, I believe we have concluded with our agenda for today. I will just note that we will attend an adjourned City Council meeting and public hearing this evening on our 2018 budget adoption. Thank you. We are adjourned.